On the 8th of March in 1945, something momentous was about to unfold at the 21st Bomber Command Headquarters on the island of Guam. Target folders were scattered across a large plotting table, and in the dim light, you could see the glow of a cigar as Major General Curtis LeMay carefully examined reconnaissance photographs showing Tokyo's manufacturing areas. What he saw were thousands upon thousands of small factories dispersed throughout neighborhoods where people lived. Machine shops had been set up in wooden structures, and parts manufacturers were operating out of homes that had been converted for industrial use. Japan's entire war machine was spread out across cities that were essentially built from wood and paper. That's when a message came in from a reconnaissance flight that had just passed over Tokyo. The news was encouraging for what LeMay had in mind. Cloud cover was minimal, wind conditions looked favorable, and the target districts had been confirmed as densely populated with these cottage-style workshops scattered everywhere. LeMay set down his coffee cup and reached for the operations telephone. Within just a few hours, 334 B-29 Superfortress bombers would be taking off from various airfields spread across Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. What nobody realized at that moment was that this single tactical decision LeMay was making would end up triggering the most catastrophic firebombing campaign that humanity had ever witnessed. The war in the Pacific had taught American military forces a crucial lesson. Japanese manufacturing wasn't concentrated in massive industrial facilities like you'd find in Detroit or Pittsburgh. Instead, it was scattered, dispersed, and deliberately hidden among the civilian population. If you could cut those supply lines, the thinking went, the entire Japanese war machine would simply grind to a halt. The way Japanese manufacturing had been set up was truly unique, having evolved over many decades of development. More than half of Tokyo's war production actually came from small workshops that employed fewer than 30 workers. You had subcontractors producing aircraft parts right in residential neighborhoods, metal fabrication happening in backyard shops, and precision instruments being assembled in temples that had been converted for wartime use. The Mitsubishi Aircraft Works alone depended on more than 300 separate suppliers that were scattered all throughout the Tokyo metropolitan area. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the absolute pinnacle of what American aviation technology could achieve at that time. Each of these massive aircraft weighed 20 tons when empty and was powered by 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, with each engine producing an impressive 2,200 horsepower. Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay stood in front of the mission briefing board, carefully studying weather patterns over the Japanese home islands. Under his command were 345 operational B-29s spread out across airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Each bomber carried a crew of 11 men and had the capability to deliver 20,000 pounds of ordnance to targets located 1,500 miles away. The B-29 represented the single most expensive weapons program of the entire Second World War. The United States had invested $3.7 billion in developing an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber in history. But attacking Japan was fundamentally different from the precision daylight bombing that had devastated German industrial facilities. The equations were completely different. High-altitude bombing was achieving hit rates of less than 5%, and this was largely due to the jet stream winds that had been discovered over Japan. These winds could exceed 250 miles per hour at bombing altitude, making accurate targeting nearly impossible. Captain Robert McNamara had been studying these troubling statistics as part of his work with the Army Air Force's Office of Statistical Control. McNamara was Harvard-educated and possessed a mind that excelled at operations research and efficiency analysis. He understood that strategic bombing ultimately came down to calculations. Tons of ordnance delivered per sortie, target elimination percentages, and the cost per square mile of manufacturing capability that you could neutralize. The difference between achieving victory and ending up in a stalemate often came down to payload efficiency and the methodology you used for selecting targets. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese Planning Committee in Tokyo, a civil defense officer named Kinshiro Fujiwara was reviewing reports about manufacturing dispersal. After the Doolittle raid back in 1942, Japanese authorities had ordered that critical war production be scattered throughout urban areas. Aircraft engine components were being manufactured in the Asakusa district. Electrical systems were being produced in Fukagawa. Ball bearings were being fabricated in Sumida Ward. Each district contained hundreds of small workshops that were integrated right into residential neighborhoods, and this had been done specifically to avoid concentrated bombing attacks. The strategy had actually worked quite well against high-altitude precision bombing. American B-29s flying at 30,000 feet were struggling to hit even the largest factory complexes. But Fujiwara's greatest fear was fire. Tokyo had burned before, you see. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 had demonstrated just how vulnerable Japanese cities were to massive conflagrations. Now, with American bombers appearing overhead almost every single day, the nightmare scenario was becoming increasingly probable. The American strategic bombing campaign had achieved minimal results through February of 1945. The 21st Bomber Command had flown 22 missions against Japanese targets since November 1944, and the results had been catastrophically poor. The Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino had been attacked 7 separate times, yet the total damage amounted to less than 4% of the facility being neutralized. General Henry Hap Arnold, who was the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had staked his reputation and the entire future of an independent Air Force on the success of the B-29 program. Political pressure was mounting with each passing day. Congress was questioning the billions that had been spent on superfortresses that seemingly couldn't hit their targets. The Navy was arguing that carrier aviation was proving more effective than strategic bombing. The Army was preparing for an invasion, convinced that air power alone could never force the Japanese to surrender. Intelligence officer Lieutenant Colonel Robert Olds had compiled extensive target analyses that revealed the fundamental problem facing the bombing campaign. Japanese weather patterns created challenges unlike anything they'd encountered in Europe. There was constant cloud cover that obscured targets. The jet stream was scattering bombs miles away from their intended aim points. Japanese fighter interceptors had learned to exploit the vulnerable moments during bomb runs when the B-29s were most exposed. Loss rates were approaching 6% per mission, which was simply unsustainable for long-term operations. At 5:35 in the evening on March 9th, the first B-29 lifted off from North Field on Guam. Unlike previous missions, this particular bomber had been stripped of all its defensive armament except for the tail guns. Ammunition had been removed, armor plating had been pulled out, and every single pound of weight savings had been converted into additional incendiary bomb load. LeMay's tactical revolution was absolutely breathtaking in its audacity. Night attack instead of day. Low altitude instead of high, 5,000 to 9,000 feet instead of 30,000. Incendiary clusters instead of high explosives. The conventional wisdom of strategic bombing had been completely inverted. Weather forecasts were indicating ideal conditions for what was planned. Surface winds of 28 miles per hour would fan flames across the target districts. Low humidity would accelerate the spread of fire. Clear skies would provide excellent visibility for the Pathfinder aircraft that would mark the targets. The calculations were absolutely devastating when you did the math. Each B-29 was carrying 40 clusters of M69 incendiary bombs. Each cluster contained 38 individual bomblets that were filled with napalm gel. The temperature at ignition exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The burning time was approximately 6 minutes. The total incendiary load per aircraft was 6 tons. Now multiply that by the 334 bombers that had been launched. The equation yielded 1,665 tons of incendiaries that would be dropped on an area of approximately 12 square miles. Tokyo's fire defenses were catastrophically inadequate for what was coming. The city had 8,000 firefighters for a population of 7 million people. There were only 3 ladder trucks capable of reaching above 2 stories. Most residential districts had no pressurized water system whatsoever. The streets were narrow and would trap civilians trying to evacuate. Wooden buildings were separated by inches rather than feet. Air raid shelters were virtually non-existent because the government believed their construction would damage civilian morale by suggesting that Tokyo could actually be bombed. The first Pathfinder aircraft arrived over Tokyo at 12:08 in the morning on March 10th. Using radar navigation, they identified the aiming point in the Shitamachi district, which was the most densely populated area of the entire city. The lead Pathfinders dropped their incendiaries in parallel lines, creating a flaming X pattern that was visible from 50 miles away. The bombers following behind would simply aim for that burning cross, dropping their loads to expand the conflagration outward. Squadron after squadron arrived over Tokyo in what became a 3-hour procession. A total of 279 B-29s reached the target area. The inferno spread exactly as the operational research had predicted it would. Individual fires began merging into area conflagrations. Those area conflagrations then escalated into a full firestorm. Temperatures at ground level exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The superheated air rose with such incredible violence that it created tornado-force winds at ground level. These winds were sucking oxygen from shelters and feeding fresh air to the flames in a self-perpetuating cycle. By 2 o'clock in the morning on March 10th, 16 square miles of Tokyo were burning. Police reports were describing scenes of absolutely unimaginable horror. Canals were boiling, asphalt streets were melting, glass windows were liquefying and flowing like water. Metal lampposts were bending from the sheer heat. The fire department's communications had completely collapsed as telephone lines burned. Tail Gunner Sergeant James Wiper reported something surprising. His guns were completely unnecessary. Japanese fighters couldn't operate in the superheated air over the city. Anti-aircraft guns had fallen silent as their crews fled from the advancing inferno. The greatest enemy turned out to be the turbulence from the thermal columns, which could flip a 60-ton bomber like a leaf caught in a hurricane. Pilots reported that they could actually smell burning flesh at 5,000 feet altitude. The devastation metrics exceeded all projections. A total of 267,151 buildings were eliminated. Over 1.8 million people were rendered homeless. The official death toll was listed as 83,793, though the actual casualties likely exceeded 100,000. More people died in those 6 hours than in any single military action in human history, including the atomic bombings that would follow 5 months later. 1/4 of Tokyo simply ceased to exist in a single night. Japanese industrial output statistics told the story in stark numerical terms. Aircraft engine assembly in the Tokyo district was reduced by 75% overnight. Precision tool operations in the affected areas were eliminated entirely. Electronic component fabrication saw 12 major suppliers completely erased. Ball bearing facilities lost 40% of national capability. The cascade effects rippled through entire supply chains as component suppliers simply vanished in flames. On March 11th, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the aftermath of what had existed just 48 hours earlier as dense urban manufacturing districts. Now, only ash fields remained, 16 square miles of scorched earth, punctuated by the occasional concrete structure that had somehow survived the inferno. Factory chimneys were standing like grave markers over incinerated facilities. Rail yards had been twisted into abstract sculptures of melted steel. The psychological impact actually exceeded even the physical damage. Worker absenteeism skyrocketed as survivors frantically searched for missing family members. Factory managers were reporting efficiency drops of 60% among traumatized workers who had survived. Military production schedules became meaningless as entire supplier networks ceased to exist. The myth of the divine wind protecting Japan from foreign invasion evaporated like morning mist. Intelligence intercepts revealed growing panic within Japanese command structures. Navy Ministry reports described a complete breakdown of coordination. Army procurement officers reported catastrophic disruption of component delivery schedules. The Munitions Ministry's statistics showed irrecoverable losses to precision manufacturing capabilities. The distributed system that had protected so well against precision bombing proved fatally vulnerable to area incendiary attacks. LeMay ordered the second wave while Tokyo was still burning. On March 11th, 285 B-29s struck Nagoya, which was Japan's primary aircraft manufacturing center. The Mitsubishi Aircraft Works had dispersed its operations among 300 subcontractors throughout the city. The firestorm eliminated them all simultaneously. 2 square miles of manufacturing district simply vaporized. Aircraft assembly dropped by 40% within 24 hours. March 13th brought devastation to Osaka. A force of 274 superfortresses dropped 1,733 tons of incendiaries on Japan's second-largest city. The Osaka arsenal, which had been producing 1/5 of Japan's ammunition, simply ceased to exist. 8 square miles of commercial districts were reduced to ash. A total of 134,144 buildings were eliminated. Port facilities that had been handling 30% of Japan's imports burned down to the waterline. March 16th witnessed the annihilation of Kobe. A massive force of 331 B-29s transformed Japan's 6th-largest city into an inferno. The Kawasaki shipyards, which had been building 1/3 of Japan's merchant vessels, burned for 3 straight days. The Mitsubishi and Kawanishi aircraft plants lost 60% of their capability. 7 square miles of urban area were eliminated. Transportation networks that had connected Western Japan to Tokyo were severed completely. March 19th completed the devastating 5-day campaign with a return strike to Nagoya. A force of 290 superfortresses finished what the first raid had started. The Aichi Aircraft Company, which had been a major producer of naval attack aircraft, lost every single one of its dispersed facilities simultaneously. Residential districts that housed skilled workers simply vaporized. Technical schools that had been training aircraft mechanics were incinerated. 3 additional square miles of manufacturing capability were removed from Japan's war economy. The statistics were absolutely irrefutable. In just 10 days, B-29s had dropped 9,373 tons of incendiaries on Japanese cities. 42 square miles of urban area had been obliterated. 1.5 million people were homeless. Output indices had collapsed across the board. Aircraft manufacturing was down 68%. Munitions assembly was down 50%. Machine tool operations were down 72%. The cascade failure of interdependent networks had created economic paralysis. But LeMay was just beginning. Operation Starvation launched simultaneously with the firebombing campaign. B-29s from the 313th Bombardment Wing began dropping naval mines in Japanese waters. The Mark 25 mine contained magnetic and acoustic sensors that made sweeping them nearly impossible. Eventually, 12,000 mines would close every major Japanese port. Import tonnage, which had already fallen 90% due to submarine warfare, dropped to virtually zero. Raw material shortages became critical within days. Steel production required iron ore from Manchuria and Korea. No ships meant no ore. No ore meant no steel. No steel meant no weapons. Aluminum production depended on bauxite from the southern resource area, and that supply was cut off completely. Aviation fuel required crude oil from the Dutch East Indies, and those pipelines were severed. Food imports that fed the workers were terminated. The economy began consuming itself in a death spiral. The campaign expanded relentlessly through the spring. On April 13th, 327 B-29s returned to Tokyo, completely obliterating the Arsenal district. April 15th saw 109 superfortresses eliminate Kawasaki's engine plants. May 14th brought 400 EV-2 bombers to Nagoya in what became the largest daylight incendiary raid of the entire war. The systematic erasure of Japanese capabilities proceeded with cold, mechanical efficiency. By May 25th, even secondary cities were facing complete annihilation. Yokohama lost 6.9 square miles, representing 42% of its entire urban area, in a single night. Tokyo was struck again, with an additional 16.8 square miles incinerated. The capital city that had once housed 7 million people was now 50% rubble. Industrial output from the Tokyo-Yokohama complex, which had been producing 35% of Japan's war material, had effectively ceased to exist. The human toll mounted beyond what anyone could truly comprehend. Each raid was producing tens of thousands of casualties. Burn victims were overwhelming medical facilities that already lacked even basic supplies. Malnutrition began spreading as food distribution networks collapsed entirely. Disease followed as sanitation systems failed. The skilled workers who were essential to precision manufacturing operations, men who had required years of specialized training, were dying by the thousands. Their loss represented knowledge and expertise that simply could not be replaced. By August 1945, this systematic annihilation had become routine. LeMay's target list had expanded to include every city with a population exceeding 30,000 people. 66 Japanese cities had been firebombed. 180 square miles of urban area had been obliterated. 21 million Japanese had been displaced from their homes. The industrial foundation that had supported the world's third-largest navy and an army of 5 million soldiers had been reduced to smoking ruins. Manufacturing statistics revealed a complete economic collapse. Aircraft assembly, which had peaked at 2,572 planes in September 1944, had fallen to just 131 by July 1945. Engine fabrication had dropped by 75%. Propeller manufacturing was down 80%. Electronic components had been virtually eliminated. The feedback loops were accelerating geometrically. No ball bearings meant no engines. No engines meant no aircraft. No aircraft meant no defense against the B-29s that arrived nightly with mechanical precision. The final statistics truly defied belief. Total bomb tonnage dropped 147,000 tons. Total sorties flown 15,000. Total B-29s lost 414 aircraft. Total American aircrew casualties approximately 2,600 men. Against these losses, Japanese casualties from strategic bombing ranged somewhere from 400,000 to 600,000 dead, with millions more injured or displaced. Tokyo alone lost more civilians in one single night than Britain lost during the entire war. Prince Fumimaro Konoe's post-war testimony to American investigators was quite explicit about what had brought about Japan's defeat. He stated that fundamentally, the thing that brought about the determination to make peace was the prolonged bombing by the B-29s. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai concurred with this assessment. He believed the B-29 was the single most important factor in causing Japan to surrender. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey reached a stunning conclusion. Japan would have surrendered by November 1945 without an invasion and without the atomic bombs, based solely on conventional bombing and naval blockade. The technological implications of this campaign revolutionized modern warfare. Strategic bombing had validated itself as a war-winning capability in its own right. The ability to eliminate entire economies from the air removed the need for costly ground invasions. The independent Air Force that General Arnold had envisioned became reality in 1947, built on the foundation of B-29's success over Japan. Every subsequent air campaign would reference the lessons learned in 1945. American industrial superiority had proved absolutely decisive. Boeing manufactured 3,170 B-29s between 1943 and 1946. Each aircraft cost $639,100, which is equivalent to about $11 million in modern currency. The total program investment of $3.7 billion has actually exceeded the Manhattan Project's $2 billion, but the return on that investment was conclusive. Japan's entire industrial foundation had been obliterated for the loss of just 414 B-29s and 2,600 aircrew members. The arithmetic of strategic warfare had been definitively solved. The moral implications generated debates that would continue for decades. International law in 1945 didn't explicitly prohibit the area bombing of cities. The Hague Conventions addressed military targets but said nothing specific about civilian workers in war industries. Japanese authorities had deliberately dispersed military production into civilian areas, making discrimination between military and civilian targets essentially impossible. American planners argued that eliminating war-making capabilities justified the civilian casualties that resulted. Critics condemned the deliberate targeting of population centers as nothing less than war crimes. General LeMay remained completely unapologetic throughout his entire life. His logic was brutally simple. We are at war with Japan. We were attacked by Japan. Do you want to kill Japanese, or would you rather have Americans killed? His reasoning was coldly practical and based on hard numbers. Operation Downfall, which was the planned invasion of Japan, had projected 1 million American casualties. Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu that was scheduled for November 1945, anticipated 250,000 casualties just in the first 30 days. Coronet, the assault on Honshu that was planned for March 1946, was expected to produce even higher losses. Japanese planning documents that were captured after the surrender revealed Operation Ketsugo, which was their defense plan that would have mobilized every Japanese citizen for resistance. 28 million civilians had been organized into combat units. Bamboo spears were being distributed to women and children. Entire populations were receiving suicide attack training. The National Resistance Program anticipated 20 million Japanese deaths in defending the homeland. Against these horrifying projections, the bombing casualties actually represented just a fraction of what invasion costs would have been. The transformation of Japan was irreversible. The country's vertically integrated zaibatsu conglomerates had been completely shattered. The distributed manufacturing system that had characterized Japanese operations was obliterated. Post-war reconstruction would require a complete reimagination of organizational structure. Interestingly, the Toyota production system and just-in-time manufacturing that would revolutionize global commerce decades later actually emerged from the ashes of 1945's devastation. Technical innovation accelerated beyond what anyone could have predicted. Radar navigation that could guide Pathfinder aircraft to targets through complete darkness. Incendiary chemistry that created unstoppable conflagrations. Operations research that optimized bombing patterns for maximum effect. Command and control systems that could coordinate hundreds of aircraft across thousands of miles. Electronic warfare capabilities that jammed Japanese radar and communications. Every single aspect of modern air warfare can trace its origins back to innovations developed and perfected over Japan. The psychological transformation proved equally profound. The Japanese concept of Yamato Damashi, the supposedly unconquerable Japanese spirit, had been broken by technology. The divine winds that had repelled Mongol invasion fleets centuries earlier couldn't stop B-29s. The warrior tradition that valued death before dishonor meant absolutely nothing against incendiary bombs dropped from 5,000 feet. The military might that had conquered all of East Asia was reduced to ash in just 5 months. The recognition of defeat became utterly undeniable. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who was chief of the Naval General Staff, testified, "I believe the Russian participation in the war against Japan, rather than the atom bombs, did more to hasten the surrender." But his own staff reports actually contradicted this claim. Naval intelligence assessments from July 1945 stated quite clearly, "The enemy's bombardment is rapidly achieving its objective of eliminating our homeland's war-making capability. Continuation of the war has become impossible." The legacy of the B-29 extended far beyond World War II. Strategic Air Command's nuclear deterrent doctrine emerged directly from the 21st Bomber Command's experience over Japan. The assumption that air power alone could determine war outcomes went on to shape Cold War strategy for decades. Vietnam, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan all witnessed attempts to replicate the success of 1945, with varying results. The promise and limitations of strategic bombing continue to influence military planning even 8 decades later. Japanese recovery required 2 full decades. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 provided crucial reconstruction demand that helped jumpstart the economy. American occupation authorities who had overseen the elimination of Japan's cities now supervised their rebuilding. The same districts that had been incinerated in 1945 became centers of the economic miracle by 1965. Toyota City rose from Nagoya's ashes. Electronics giants emerged from Tokyo's burned districts. The world's second-largest economy grew from what had been history's most complete annihilation. Curtis LeMay was promoted to lieutenant general just 2 weeks after Japan's surrender. His subsequent command of Strategic Air Command from 1948 to 1957 shaped American nuclear strategy throughout the Cold War. The same calculated logic that had determined incendiary bomb loads over Tokyo would later determine nuclear targeting of Soviet cities. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction descended directly from the precedent set by Operation Meeting House. Robert McNamara, who had analyzed bombing effectiveness for LeMay's during the war, later served as Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. In his 2003 documentary, The Fog of War, he reflected on the firebombing campaign with remarkable honesty. He recalled that LeMay had said, "If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." And I think he's right. He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. The moral questions raised by the campaign against Japanese cities continue to resonate in modern debates about civilian casualties and the principle of proportionality in warfare. The last B-29 combat mission flew on August 14, 1945, just hours before Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender to the world. A force of 143 superfortresses struck the Nippon Oil Company refinery at Tsuchizaki. As the bombers were returning to base, radio operators received the ceasefire order. The strategic bombing campaign that had reduced Japanese war-making capabilities by 70% was finally complete. The final equation was absolutely conclusive. 147,000 tons of bombs dropped, 66 cities obliterated, an entire economy eliminated. In the depths of Tokyo Bay, the battleship Nagato rested on the harbor bottom, sunk by American carrier aircraft. Once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, her massive guns that could hurl 3,200-pound shells 25 miles, had proved completely worthless against bombers flying from islands 500 miles away. The age of the battleship had definitively ended. The era of strategic air power had begun. Modern economies could be eliminated from the air. Curtis LeMay and his B-29s had proved it with calculated certainty over the burning cities of Japan. The bamboo spears that had been distributed to Japanese civilians for homeland defense were never actually used in combat. They rest today in museums as relics of a war that ended not through invasion, but through the systematic aerial elimination of industrial capabilities. The B-29 hadn't just obliterated Japanese manufacturing facilities and infrastructure. It had demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare belonged to the nation with superior technology, industrial resources, and most importantly, the strategic logic to employ them effectively. In the ashes of 66 Japanese cities, the foundation of the modern world order was firmly established.